This Agile conference, to me, is very different. It's a group of people who are really trying to amplify the value creation capability of individuals, teams, and companies. And that's what I want to talk about today, and then give a value proposition for the forum. When I went to be the CEO of SRI International, it had been declining for 20 years, and it was a very unhappy place. It was close to bankruptcy. And when I left, we grew it 3.5 times. And we created such major innovations as Siri, high definition television, intuitive surgical. The team won 2 Emmys. And it was a completely different place. I wrote a book about this. It was a top 10 business book when it came out. And I just published a Harvard Business Review article. And the reason I'm here is because not only did I see a profound difference in what we were able to do, I saw a profound difference in what it did for people. People who learn these kinds of skills that we're talking about at the forum really have their lives transformed in a positive way. So that's why I now teach at Northeastern University and Worcester Polytech. I want to share these ideas with people. And the key is to how do you make the results you want inevitable? Now, I've done workshops with thousands of professionals with great companies all over the world. I won't mention them, but top 50 companies in all over, literally in every country where there's these big companies reside. And what we typically discover is less than 25% of what they're working on would have any value if it's completed. And we don't decide that. We just give them a framework for them to decide. So the first thing to start with is, what are the definitions we need to be able to talk about this? So we break value creation and innovation into 2 parts. Value creation is the process of creating solutions to important unmet end user or customer needs and with their stakeholders that are better than any alternative. Value creation is the process of putting the puzzle together. Innovation is when you deliver that value, that customer value, into the society, into the marketplace, with a sustainable business model. So here's a segue as an example. So our job is to create value for our customers. That's the starting job of every enterprise, and then deliver it successfully with a value proposition that gives value to all the other stakeholders. So in a simple way, what are we trying to do? Well, we want to create solutions that matter to others. That's the key thing. I want to do positive things for our customers so they'll appreciate the contributions we make. And at the highest level, how are we going to do this? We're going to do this by using the best searching, learning, and improving practices throughout the enterprise. There have been several talks, great talks today about how every position in the company ought to be, in its own way, at its own level, working to create more value for the customers. And so that's kind of the objective. And the way to do that is by using the best methods and the best capabilities. So what's fundamental to doing this? Well, obviously, you need to be able to identify unmet customer needs, and that turns out to be a really hard thing to do. You need ideas and knowledge to be able to do that. You need to be able to talk to each other, so you need shared language tools and networks, access to the ideas and the knowledge you need. And you need to be able to do compound learning. Compound learning. Vivek just gave a brilliant talk about what's happening in the world and how it's increasing exponentially, number one, but 2, how it's converging. And so if your innovation processes don't compound, that is, they're not exponential, then you're probably falling behind exponentially fast, which is, I think, one reason why Vivek said most big companies who can't do this really are on a glide path to going out of business. And of course, you need great people and you need great resources to make this all happen. So in a typical company, you're going to have a network of people, functions, and what have you. And the network you develop ought to be to support your business model. The business model comes first, then you figure out, how do we put the ingredients together in the best way to maximize the learning and the value creation to be able to solve the needs of our customers? And of course, in a dynamic world like Vivek mentioned, these relationships and connections are varying dramatically as well. So you need to be able to configure the right network of the right partners to get the information you need, because if you're not providing the right information to your people, they're not going to be able to innovate as fast as they need to keep up. The problem here is a number of problems of how you organize that, but another problem is, as Vivek also brilliantly pointed out, almost all the major opportunities today are interdisciplinary. That is, they're made up of multiple disciplines, and each discipline speaks its own language. So if you're a biologist working with an electrical engineer, you all have your own mental frameworks and tools that you use to be able to make progress. But when you come together, those languages actually create kind of a barrier. And of course, there are different functions with different goals and what have you, and of course, different cultures. All of these things inhibit or can inhibit communication, which is essential. So in many organizations, we see it's kind of like a Tower of Babel. Everybody's speaking different languages, but none of them are sharing the one essential language they need, which is the language of the customer. So we've thought about this a lot, and we finally decided the most important concept for value creation is what we call the value proposition. And after trying everything we could think of, we came down to there being 4 fundamental questions that have to be answered in all situations. What's the need, the unmet need? Basically, what are you trying to do? Why are you trying to do it? What's your approach for that? That's the offering and usually the business model and other considerations. What are the benefits per cost? That's the definition of customer value or enterprise value. And what's the competition? So those are 4 questions for everything we do in business. And whether it's a small one or a big one, what's the need? What's your approach? What are the benefits per cost? And what's the competition? These 4 questions are things we intuitively do in our normal life all the time. If we decide to go to have lunch with our buddy, we'll have to figure out, what kind of food we want, where we're going to go do that, the different benefits and costs of those different kinds of food, and we'll compare it to the 5 other restaurants we could pick. We do this all the time. Most of these decisions are pretty fast and intuitive, like buying lunch. Buying a car might take a couple weeks. And of course, if you're forming major ventures, like when we formed Siri, it can take years to answer just these 4 questions. And one of our principles is if you can't answer at least these 4 questions, you still don't really know what you're doing. So Hugo asked me to show you an example of this for the World Agility Forum. So here's an example, a quick example. What's the need? Improve the world's ability to deliver value to society. That's the meta need that we're all trying to solve. We've all, I think, observed that in most companies, performance is pretty poor. In my experience, less than 25% of R&D in the biggest companies in the world or universities, less than 25% of it has any utility today. So there's certainly room for improvement. And of course, leaders are often frustrated. We just heard this from Annika and others, that many approaches do not seem to help as much as they want them to. So what's the approach? Well, we're creating a forum with masterclasses, articles, webinars, and it's different in the sense that it promotes continuous learning about all aspects of value creation, how to improve business models, methods, and relationships in this digital age that we just heard about. What are the benefits per cost of this? Well, we see the opportunity, we see the failures, we see the waste. And if we could improve just 10% of R&D globally, that would repurpose $200 billion of R&D a year. But the numbers here are staggering. And the upside, of course, is not just that, not just repurposing the R&D, it's actually working on things that matter. And again, I want to emphasize what Vivek said. Most people do not understand interdisciplinary R&D to form these major new opportunities that are opening up all the time. There is much more than a factor of 2 if we better understood those. And of course, there's lots of ways we can, the competition and alternatives for the forum. They're obviously ones that are focused on other aspects of business. That's terrific. That's really valuable. But there are also a lot of things that, from my point of view, don't focus on the core elements of the learning science side of what we do, because it's the learning and improving and the creating to solve problems that have meaning for others that really distinguishes success and distinguishes this forum. So let me describe one other key thing. Again, building on Vivek's point, in an exponential world, when you bring ideas together, and particularly interdisciplinary ideas, they have to compound. You need to one idea has to build rapidly on top of another if you're going to solve that problem fast enough. So you bring in ideas. VCF here is what we're going to call value creation forums. Then you iterate again, you do it again, you bring in more ideas, and you keep on this iteration process, and you drive this really hard and really fast. So some of you do Scrum will recognize this as kind of one of the basic building blocks. Now, what we've discovered is if we use the NABC framework as the core framework for all of these meetings within a company, we have multiple teams come in, they have very short presentations, and we meet regularly. I mean, it can be every day sometimes, but usually typically 1 to 6 weeks when we're developing things of significance. And of course, the goal is to bring the best ideas in here to compound faster. So you develop a network of the appropriate customers, partners, inside and outside, no barriers, no walls, radical transparency, bring the best people in, and drive this process really hard. And the NABC framework allows something which is a little hard to explain here, but it allows comparative learning. You compare one value proposition to another, and it turns out that's the best way we learn, and it really does drive exponential improvement in these kinds of value creation forums. So to make this work, of course, there are a number of other business guiding principles. First off, the business fundamentals. You have to know what a business model is and a lot of other things to be able to make sense out of this. Active learning. Active learning is the education science for how people learn and improve the best. And here are 3 examples. You have to repeatedly do the task. So I was mentioning that culture comes from behavior. Well, behavior it means you're doing the task over and over again, and then all of a sudden the mental models and the culture change. Small teams, why small teams? Because you need a team that's big enough to have the perspectives necessary to solve a task. But once you get beyond 5 or 7 team members, it tends to break down a little bit, and not everyone is 100% involved. So you want to break it down into small teams. That's a basic learning principle. And you want to start with the big ideas first. You want to if you don't get the fundamentals right, this is what Musk does brilliantly. He focuses first on the fundamentals, gets them right, and then he goes forward. You recognize that those of you who do complexity analysis will recognize that is also a fundamental principle of that. Complexity analysis tells us what kind of tools to use for different kinds of tasks. So if we're doing kind of basic researchy things, those evolve. They don't just, you can't plan them, they evolve. So you use a certain kind of tools for those. Complex problems use management tools. And of course, if it's a simple task, you do things like checklists. So understanding complexity analysis tells what kind of tools we ought to be using in the different functions across the enterprise. Team science, how do we put teams together? One of our rules is the team must share the vision, have unique complementary skills, and share in the rewards. If you violate those 3 principles, the team's not going to work effectively together. And the last one is the behavioral sciences, which tell us a lot about value creation. Just one, some of you may know this. If you study prospect theory, you know that if you do something good for somebody, as opposed to doing something bad for them or damaging to them, or it's unpleasant, the negative thing is more than 2 times worse than the positive thing you give them. So you give them $10, they feel good. If you take $10 away, they feel twice as bad. So that's fundamental to an understanding of value creation. So just to wrap this all up, I think of these kind of as the 3 laws. I mean, that's a strong term to call anything in business, but this is what I look for when I walk into an enterprise. I want to see if they're doing these 3 things. The first thing is, are they working on important unmet customer and market needs? And do they understand what that means? And do people have the processes to be able to do that? This is really hard. In our workshops, almost all the failures start with not identifying the actual need. It has to be constantly reframed and rethought, and the organization has to know what that means. The second thing is shared value creation language, concepts, and tools. I mentioned one of the tools, NABC value propositions. If you can't communicate with each other in an interdisciplinary world, you're not going to be effective. We think that's really fundamental. And I would tell you, if you're an enterprise like SRI when I was CEO, where everybody understands at least that much, it's transformative, because all of a sudden, everybody's putting the customer first. And everybody understands that they're not just solving problems, they're solving problems that have meaning for others. And the third thing is intense iteration and recurring value creation forums. So we all believe here in intense iteration, but the value creation forums are designed to create compound learning. That means that's the exponential improvement we want to survive in the world that Vivek mentioned. And what that encourages, because these are stand-up meetings every week or 2 or 3 weeks, every 1 to 6 weeks, it creates radical transparency across the enterprise. And radical transparency is an amazingly effective way to help people learn, to get access to the right information, and to encourage the people who really do want to achieve, as opposed to those who don't. I really recommend. Most companies are not nearly as transparent as they ought to be, but it's really, really effective. So with that, most of you in the audience will recognize these principles as being fundamental to what we think of as the Agile portfolio of methodologies. And I want to thank you. It's great to be with people who share this and who are working to really make the world a much better place. So with that, I thank you.